China has plans for Afghanistan. Hong Kong goes after terrorists. And Xi Jinping talks about wealth redistribution. That and more on this week's China News Headlines. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This week's China News Headlines. So unless you've been living in a cave like some kind of terrorist, you know Afghanistan will soon have a new legitimate government that will establish an open and inclusive regime structure through dialogue and consultation. At least that's apparently what the Chinese Communist Party says.
China anticipates that the Afghan Taliban and various factions in the country will establish an open and inclusive regime structure through dialogue and consultation, implement moderate and stable domestic and foreign policies, and effectively protect the safety of foreign institutions and personnel in Afghanistan.
This is the Taliban you're talking about, right? But China says it's ready for friendly relations with the Taliban and welcomes Afghan development projects. China hasn't even shut its embassy in Kabul.
As a friendly neighbor and sincere friend of Afghanistan, China has always pursued a friendly policy in relations to all the Afghan people. Since the past, in the present, or in the future, this policy will not change. China will continue to support Afghanistan's peaceful reconstruction and, within its capacity, contribute to the Afghan economy and provide assistance for social development.
China, simping hard for terrorists. Sorry, did I say terrorists? I meant China will work with the totally legitimate Taliban government to crack down on the real terrorists, Uyghur Muslims. Zhao mentioned a terrorist group called the East Turkestan Islamic Movement.
We also expect the Taliban will resolutely crack down on all kinds of terrorist forces, including the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, and fulfilled their promise not to allow any forces to use Afghanistan's territory to threaten the security of neighboring countries.
Now, the issue of what the Chinese regime calls Uyghur terrorism is complicated. It could probably be its own episode. But independent researchers have said that the East Turkestan Islamic movement no longer really exists. And even when it existed, there is no evidence that this small, under-resourced group ever instigated violence inside China or anywhere in the world. It certainly doesn't justify the Chinese Communist Party's genocide of an entire ethnic group. But the Chinese regime isn't the only one talking about an open and inclusive Afghanistan. That's what the Taliban is saying themselves, as they try to convince the world that they've totally changed. Maybe that's what the Taliban has really learned from the Chinese Communist Party. How to say all the right things so the world believes you're not so bad after all, which leaves you free to commit all the atrocities you want. For more on the situation in Afghanistan and China's role in the chaos, check out this week's episode, Is China Teaming Up with the Taliban? Now, you might be thinking, Chris, the Chinese regime is committing genocide on Uyghurs in China, a Muslim ethnic group? Surely that will cause some tension between the Communist Party and the fine people over in the Taliban. Well, not to worry. The Taliban have already reassured the Chinese regime that they will not interfere. Most other Muslim-majority countries have been totally fine with the Uyghur genocide too. A Chinese refugee recently accused China of operating a secret jail for Uyghurs in Dubai. And Chinese leader Xi Jinping just met with both the Iranian and Iraqi presidents. So with any luck, Xi can spread a little bit of that peace in the Middle East, with Chinese characteristics. And coming up after the break, the Chinese regime is going after one type of terrorist, Hong Kongers. Welcome back. Speaking of China teaming up with totally legitimate governments to tackle terrorists, Hong Kong police have arrested students for advocating terrorism. You may remember back in July, a Hong Kong policeman was stabbed. The man who did that killed himself shortly after. Well, 4 student union leaders were arrested on Wednesday on suspicion of advocating terrorism after they held a moment of silence for the man. The arrest was made by Hong Kong's new National Security Police. Chief Executive Carrie Lam personally wanted it done. She also has a message to Hong Kong's lawyers. Toe the Communist Party line. It's been a bad week for Hong Kong. Actually, a bad few years for Hong Kong. But this week, the group that organized most of the big protests in Hong Kong in 2019, the Civil Human Rights Front, was forced to disband. Some of their protests saw millions of Hong Kongers marching through the streets. The 612 Humanitarian Relief Fund was also forced to shut down. It provided funds to protesters for medical aid, counseling, legal advice, and emergency financial relief, including loans for bail money for arrested protesters. And as I mentioned last week, Hong Kong's biggest teachers' union disbanded under government pressure. So yes, the Chinese Communist Party is attacking known terrorists like Hong Kong teachers and students while teaming up with the Taliban. And here's a shocking development. Xi Jinping, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, is advocating communist wealth redistribution. In a speech published on state-run Xinhua, Xi speaks to us from his heavenly abode, calling for a system to redistribute wealth in the interest of social fairness. Xi said it was necessary to reasonably regulate excessively high incomes and encourage high-income people and enterprises to return more to society. I think this answers the question of whether China's Communist Party is still communist. But what's interesting is Xi used a phrase usually attributed to Mao. Xi talked about common prosperity as the prosperity of all the people, not the prosperity of a few people. Is one dear leader comparing himself with another dear leader? I wonder if that has anything to do with next year's meeting of top party officials, where Xi will either be ousted or maintain his grip on power as China's presentator for life. And just like Mao, Xi knows the importance of the children. That's why, as students across the country return from summer break in September, they'll find one more course on their curriculum: Xi Jinping thought. This is why Chinese students outperform American students. I don't even remember learning about Xi Jinping thought when I went to school. I had to learn worthless things like history and civics. The mandatory textbook titled Xi Jinping Thought on Socialism with Chinese Characteristics in the New Era will have 5 editions to be taught to students in grades 3, 5, 8, and 10 on a weekly basis. According to China's Ministry of Education, it will gradually shape students' support for the party's leadership and the socialist system. And if that doesn't work, the Communist Party has a way to eliminate wrong thoughts. But just to make sure no filthy foreign concepts pollute the minds of the Chinese youth, the party has canceled almost 300 partnerships with foreign universities. This comes close on the heels of a ban earlier this month on most classes with teachers based in foreign countries. They haven't banned foreign teachers who are already in China, but it may just be a matter of time. So maybe go teach English in Taiwan. And after the break, a new type of counterfeit good from China could cause big problems for police in the United States. Welcome back. U.S. Customs and Border Protection has seized counterfeit DEA and FBI badges from China. According to a spokesperson, these counterfeit badges could have led to disastrous consequences if our officers had not found them. Criminal organizations could have used these badges for their illicit activity under the guise of federal agents. China is also apparently counterfeiting COVID vaccination cards. It's not hard to imagine this being part of China's political warfare campaign against the U.S. Even worse were the Chinese counterfeit female body inspector badges. Imagine the nefarious actions those could have caused. A new report by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center looked at hundreds of Belt and Road infrastructure projects around the world. Between 2013 and 2020, they found almost 700 human rights abuse allegations linked to Chinese business conduct abroad. The most violations happened in Myanmar, also known as Burma, and they happened before the military coup too. Speaking of the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese telecom Huawei has been a major Trojan horse in these projects. which is why it's such great news that Huawei will invest $100 million in Asia-Pacific startups over the next 3 years. Huawei is great. Like, you know how sometimes you forget your keys and you get locked out of your home? If only you could get in the back door. Well, Huawei has thought of this too, and they've allegedly installed some very helpful back doors in a Pakistani project. Of course, the Pakistani project was a collaboration between Huawei and a US company. And the US company says Huawei used the back door to steal their intellectual property. Stop me if you've heard this story before. And finally, today, an update on the China-Lithuania feud. China is furious at Lithuania for setting up a de facto Taiwanese embassy. And now, China is halting all rail freight to Lithuania. Devastating. No more fidget spinners for Lithuania. And now it's time for me to answer a question from a member of the China Uncensored 50-Cent Army, fans who support us and our efforts to expose the truth about the Chinese Communist Party by contributing through the crowdfunding website Patreon. Jack Spence says, I'm concerned that the CCP will accelerate its aggression toward Japan, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, since the US has a weak and confused leadership. You know, Jack, this is a concern I have as well. Well, the Chinese regime can't really accelerate its aggression toward Hong Kong. That's already happening at full speed. But what happens to Japan depends on what happens to Taiwan. And I'm concerned the Chinese Communist Party might make a big miscalculation. The way the Biden administration handled the Afghanistan pullout was not great. And the CCP is using that as proof the US won't back Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion. But Taiwan is not Afghanistan. There are plenty of people who question why we even went into Afghanistan. The US attempted and botched some kind of democratic nation building there and quickly collapsed. Taiwan, however, is already an independent, thriving democracy. Defending Taiwan from invasion from the world's biggest authoritarian regime is an entirely different scenario to the war in Afghanistan. But if the Communist Party takes the US failure in Afghanistan as proof the US won't defend Taiwan, that might make them think now's the time for an invasion. But I think the US, Japan, Australia, really the entire free world would back Taiwan. So if the CCP makes a move, that could drag us all into war. But don't worry, I'm sure Xi Jinping is getting all the best information from his lackeys. Thanks for your question and your support, Jack. And big thank you to everyone who supports China Uncensored on Patreon. We could not do this show without you. So thank you for joining us in the fight to expose the Chinese Communist Party to the world. If you're interested in joining, head over to patreon.com/China Uncensored. You'll get a bunch of cool perks, including the chance to have me answer your question on the show. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.